As Jeannie said, I'm relatively new. I've been here about 8 months. And soon after I arrived, Chris, Tina Fearon, and I were looking at our upcoming calendar of programs and decided to put a lecture on the books for me in March. But back in July, I didn't really know what I might be working on in March. So we kind of came up with some boilerplate language here. Fleming Museum's new curator discusses the process of uncovering little-seen aspects of the permanent collection through our explorations of museum's collection storage, highlights the opportunity for open-ended discovery by engaging with unique art objects. And so it was vague for the time being, but it seemed appropriate as a topic for the lecture because it got to the heart of one of the things I felt that I was brought here to do. Many museums and many curators have, over the last century, become increasingly preoccupied with temporary loan exhibitions as opposed to focusing on a museum's own permanent collection. And of course that's great. Temporary exhibitions are a lot of fun and interesting and really bring things that local audiences may not have seen and may not see again at their own local museum. And I've been very excited by the ones I've worked on here so far, the Pop Art Prints show and Samuel Bach show that are on view now, and ones coming up in the next few years that I think will be great fun. But they're also a lot of work, and the more time spent on those temporary exhibitions can mean less time spent on researching and exhibiting aspects of the permanent collection. And so with 25,000 objects in the Fleming's permanent collection, there's so much more that's still there to be discovered and to be researched and to be brought out and shown to the public. And so it was clear to me from the discussions I had with Jeannie and the rest of the Fleming staff when I was brought on here that they really wanted someone passionate about doing more of that work on the collection. And I felt very strongly about that. So how does someone get to know a collection of 25,000 objects? We have a collections database, but that's not exactly conducive to browsing. And so what you do to kind of get to know the collection at hand is to walk through our art storage spaces. And then you do it again because the first time you're kind of overwhelmed and you don't really take in what you were seeing. And then you do it again and again. And really every time I walk through there, I discover something new that I didn't notice before. And I bet that goes for my colleagues who've been here 8 or 18 years, as well as me who's been here 8 months. And so I can't physically take you all into collection storage to experience that, so I'm kind of going to set the scene for you a bit. So this is kind of a glimpse at what our collection storage looks like. So imagine walking into this space with that slightly musty smell in your nose and peering into these shells, these open shells, and finding ancient Roman glassware, or a Zuni jar, or a South African basket, a Buddhist head from 3rd century Pakistan, paintings, drawings, prints, on and on. So as a curator, how do you approach this broad a collection and decide what aspect of it you want to focus on or pursue first? And sometimes you go with your gut. And so I found myself drawn to these, a group of Japanese miniatures, or at least, if not made by a Japanese maker, objects made to look like Japanese objects, Japanese lacquerware objects, including a towel rack, a bench, a table, chest of drawers, teapot, cricket cage, lantern, boxes, a mirror case and stand, and other household accessories. So I include the informal iPhone photographs to give you a sense of kind of coming upon these things in their natural storage habitat. But here are the glamour shots, which are very nicer, courtesy of Chris Dissinger, our PR and marketing guy, who, lucky for us, is also a stellar photographer. And in pulling some of these out to get their photographs taken, we discovered something else about them, which is that a lot of them open and reveal more miniature objects inside of them, which is just the coolest thing. I'm so excited about this. So I'll tell you a bit more about what we know and don't know about these miniatures towards the end of my lecture. I'm going to build the suspense. But I kept coming across these things that could be considered miniatures in some way. Scaled down versions of full-size objects. From things like this that are kind of the appropriate size for a doll's house, to larger models of houses themselves, or vehicles like boats or carriages. So what fascinated me was that these were coming from cultures all over the world, from not just modern day US or Japan, but India, Hawaii, the Philippines, pre-Columbian Mexico, ancient Egypt, Indonesia, various Native American and Inuit groups. And so what a sure sign of our love of small and scaled down representations of things, that this is really kind of a global phenomenon in some way. And probably an instinctual one at that, part of the same evolutionary impulse that causes us to find babies or baby animals really cute, right? Is that urge to take care of them when they can't yet take care of themselves. I think some of that is at play in our love of small objects as well as small people and animals. But to push beyond that idea that these things exist just because people love small things, what function were these miniatures and models serving in the particular cultures that they came from? Dolls and dollhouse furniture, action figures, and other accessories like that, we're sort of familiar with the idea that they serve childhood play, and that play is often kind of emulating adult behaviors and spaces. But then those objects then kind of become a fine decorative art for adults, and there's some nostalgia there as well. And that could be where the Japanese miniatures fit in, because they don't seem to me like objects that a child would play with. But sort of more on that in a bit. But what about the rest of those objects that I showed you, or other objects that I was finding? So I decided to explore this topic in the best way that I know how to, which is to plan an exhibition around them. And it's sort of in keeping with my mandate to work more with the permanent collection, doing exhibitions from our collection, particularly of unexplored kind of groups or themes of objects in our collection, was a perfect fit. So I proposed the idea to our staff, and it's tentatively scheduled for spring 2018, about 2 years from now. And so, which is all to say that the planning of this exhibition is very much in its early stages, in that I've had the idea for the show, and I have a group of objects that might go in the show, but I haven't done a lot of the research that will ultimately go into the show before it's put on view. What little research I've done so far is actually prompted by the fact that this lecture was coming up. So, normally you hear a lecture from someone who's a lot further along in their kind of expertise on the subject, but kind of in keeping with the idea that this is behind the scenes, or kind of a getting to know you, since I'm relatively new here. I kind of wanted to give you a sense of where these exhibition ideas come from, and how you go about probing these kind of unknown objects for a sense of what they meant. I, in particular, have long been I've long been fascinated by the idea that what interests a scholar or curator has a kind of personal origin as well, that there are some personal origins to your interest in a particular topic, subject, theme. So that was definitely the case for me here. So when I was a kid, from about the age of 7 or 8 to 10 to 11, my mom's sister and I would go every year to the annual convention of the International Guild of Miniature Artisans. So it was just a really fun thing to check out, check out all the really cool models, and there would be kind of a sales hall at the end of it where you could shop around to different makers, and my sister and I would each get to pick out 1 or 2 things that we'd get to buy and take home with us. So this is my paltry collection, which I still have. It still makes me happy when I come upon these things, when I go home for vacations and find them in my dresser. And I always like particularly to pick something that was kind of somehow clever in the way that it referenced real world objects. You see a lot of brand names in this one. Or the way it uses materials to emulate on a miniature scale what is usually large. And it's interesting, I think, in the way of all craft pursuits, the internet has really kind of been a boon to miniature artisans, professional and amateur. So all you need to do is go to Pinterest and search dollhouse miniatures to find a ton of really cool tutorials about how to make things like this. And so when I studied studio art at Smith College as an undergrad, but I knew I was interested in being a curator. And the idea of using miniatures to express that and express myself came up in a few projects where I ended up kind of creating miniature copies of famous or contemporary artworks and then kind of curating them into my own mini museums. Fleming people no doubt be familiar with Demoiselle d'Avignon on miniature scale, the Marcel Duchamp bicycle wheel, the Magritte Cécile Paz and Peak, which I was particularly proud of. On the far end is Rudolf Stingel and Eva Hesse. So that was a lot of fun. And talk about play kind of meant to emulate adult behaviors and spaces, right? So I was getting to model my future career in miniature. I also became, as I became more interested in contemporary art, also became interested in other artists who were using, creating or using miniatures in their work in some way. And so I hope to do a future show on that as well. Maybe that'll be part 2 of this global miniature show that I'm doing. So this is all to say that I was really primed to be excited by the miniatures that I was discovering in the Fleming collection. And so I was and still am excited to dive into them and learn more and to think more broadly about how miniature objects not only serve specific functional or ritual purposes, but also how they become bearers of meaning in all kinds of ways. And for example, one need look no further than the Sex Objects show currently on view to see how dolls and dollhouses and miniature versions of adult objects are serving to model or reinforce or subvert societal gender norms from a young age. And so, again, what purposes are some of the objects in the Fleming's collection that I was finding? What purposes were they serving? And how do you go about researching that? These are kinds of objects that may not be very well documented or researched either within our own files or kind of in the scholarship at large. So I'll model some of the kind of funky ways I ended up finding out what these things were. But I also hit some dead ends so far. Again, I didn't have a ton of time. So this talk is a bit shorter than the usual lecture. That just means we'll have more time for questions. I'll start with one that I thought would be relatively easy to figure out and for a reason that I'll explain in a minute. This is a ceramic object from pre-Columbian culture in what is now Mexico, probably the Colima or Nayarit peoples. I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. From about 300 BCE to 300 CE. And our records describe it as possibly the lid of a vessel in the form of a hut with a dog sitting on its hindquarters on the roof. And the reason I thought this would be a good one to start with is that the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York currently has an exhibition of architectural models from the ancient Americas, most of which were serving some kind of funerary purpose, either as part of a pre-burial ritual, or they were interred with the dead, or a combination of both functions. And the models in the show range from like abstracted and minimalist representations to very elaborate architectural complexes. And the show is the first on this subject in the US. And you can check out the website. They have the whole checklist online. But it's also on view until September, so if you're in New York, before then you'll have a chance to see it. There's also a small publication you can get at the library, although not right now because I have it checked out. And these models are maybe better called effigies than models because they're not prototypes for actual buildings. They're representations of these buildings. Nonetheless, they give scholars a sense of the architectural styles that were employed by these cultures when actual remains of buildings may be very few and far between. But they serve the purpose of symbolically representing those structures that were important to the community, and that varies from temples and ball courts to even the family home. Maybe by being interred with the dead, were intended to provide a peaceful resting place for the spirit of the dead, or a connection to deities who were thought to really kind of reside in these spaces. The exhibition at the Met includes examples from the Nair and Kalima cultures. And so, that's definitely suggests that those cultures were actively creating a variety of these types of architectural effigies. And also, a lot of the models in the show were serving as vessels of some kind. And so all that sort of supports the idea that the object in the Fleming's collection was also serving a similar purpose. Furthermore, dogs have a funerary association in these cultures, particularly in the Kalima culture. Dogs were thought to serve as guiders of souls in the underworld. And so ceramic figurines or vessels in the shapes of dogs were often found in burials. And we have some other examples of that in our collection, including one that is currently on view in the West Corridor off the lobby in our pre-Columbian installation. So both the house and dog-shaped vessels may have been filled with libations to be poured out during the burial ritual, or with food to nourish the dead on their journey to the underworld, or, and this was appropriate, dogs were also eaten at feasts, so there's that double meaning there. But then the function as vessels could also just been symbolic, like just kind of creating a void for the deity to fill. So funerary miniatures or models are common to many cultures, and perhaps kind of the most famous example is with ancient Egypt. The tombs of prosperous individuals were filled with miniature versions of people, places, and things that would help make the afterlife as comfortable and abundant as their life was, including servants to do their bidding. And here are some examples of servants that are from our collection that are on view in our Egyptian gallery. And in addition to the servants, the models provided space for the servants to do their work. So this is an example, again, from the Metropolitan Museum of a granary. So on the right side of the model, you see servants carrying the bales of grain, but then on the left side, you see them keeping the accounts of the grain. So, even keeping your records up to date in the afterlife was still important, which I find really amusing. So we don't have an example as grand as the Met's in our collection. This is kind of the closest we have. So this is a boat with figures on it. And unfortunately, it's not in great condition. Each figure differs stylistically from each one, kind of suggesting that they came from different sources. They've been glued on rather than being pegged as they would have been in ancient times. They seem to be facing backwards towards the stern of the boat, so a hint that whoever put it together didn't quite know what they were looking at. And the mast seems to be new wood, so it's not really kind of a pure example that we can turn to. As you might expect from a civilization that organized itself around a great river, Egyptians saw death as a boat journey along the Nile, and this was represented with the inclusion in tombs of model boats in wood, populated by oarsmen, mourners, and the deceased themselves, sometimes in mummy form, sometimes as their living form or as a statue. And these models might even have represented an actual journey that the mummy would have taken up or down the Nile. But then you also find boat models meant to represent leisure activities. Again, that sense of if they enjoyed it in their life, they should be able to enjoy it in their afterlife, including a nice picnic on a boat serenaded by musicians, that kind of thing. We really can't tell from our model in its unpure state which type this might have been. Slightly more intriguing to me, though, was this guy, which is this big. You can see the dimensions. You can see its size relative to a pencil. It's a miniature headrest. A lot of different cultures, instead of a pillow, would have this thing that you rested your neck on to keep your hairdo in place. And again, it's tiny sized. It's really too small for the mummy itself to have enjoyed. And so I thought, well, maybe it was for one of those model servants or something like that. And it turns out that it's actually an amulet. And amulets are small objects that we carry around to give us some kind of blessing or power. And usually they're in the form of a god whose power you're calling upon. And you can see examples of this again in our Egyptian gallery. But it turns out that they would also create amulets in the form of functional objects like headrests or even an arm or a leg. And then they would wrap these in the mummy's bandages so that the mummy would have use of that object in the afterlife. So even though it's miniature, it's still for the comfort of the mummy to rest their head on in the afterlife. Once again, ensuring eternal comfort. So those are some examples of some ritual uses of these objects. And what about educational ones? There's the situation which is not unique to our museums by any means, but it is a quirk of our collection that in the early years of our history, the curators were not as discerning about the gifts that they accepted for the museum as we are today. And so you do come across some odd ducks in the collection, like these 3 ship models. And I'm sorry for the poor photographs, they're kind of delicate, so I didn't really want to move them to take better pictures of them. But from left to right, you see a model of a Spanish galleon, an English galleon in the middle, and then Roman slave galley on the right, the white one. And these were created and donated by a Burlington resident in 1940, an amateur model maker named Antonio Gallinao. Does that name mean anything to anyone? No relatives in the audience. I just want to make sure in Vermont. Can't be too sure. And so they were meant as educational models and kind of a hobby. A lot of people were doing shipbuilding kind of as a fun hobby in their spare time. And in fact, the plans for the Spanish galleon came from the magazine Popular Science. And you could send away for these plans for $1 and create the model. And that's what he did. The problem is they're not actually that historically accurate. It turns out the man who created the plans for Popular Science was a man named E. Armitage McCann and made a lot of shipbuilding manuals and stuff like that, but it turned out his galleons were not kind of accurate in their proportions. So, we have these things that are supposed to be educational but can't really function as educational objects because they're not actually accurate. And so they just occupy this strange in-between category in our collection. What do you do with them? They don't really fit in most of our collecting categories. They're just kind of a funky nod to our museum's history and to the hobby of a Burlington resident, and to go into my funny little show. So Mr. Gallinao is not the only Burlington area miniaturist to contribute to the Fleming's education collections. And this is in the education collections, they're objects specifically designated to be used for teaching. So we had, I guess, a bunch of Japanese miniatures, a different group than the ones I showed you earlier. And we commissioned this woman, Ms. Valerie Ryder of South Burlington, to create a miniature room to house all of them. But the items were sort of too numerous and diverse to fit into just one kind of replica Japanese room. So instead she made a replica antique shop, Japanese antique shop. It's pretty well done. It's got its own light sources. So there's sort of a light bulb up in the corner under the roof, and then a light bulb behind that paper window. So that it really actually creates this very nice warm light that's pretty realistic, it seems. So that's kind of a cool other little aside. Sometimes useful discoveries come about in a totally roundabout way. So I'm going to share an example of that. One of the miniature objects I was trying to find out more about was this kind of a group of Indian brass models of carriages and palanquins, which is not how I thought that word would be pronounced, but I looked it up. In looking around for sort of similar examples, trying to figure out what these were, I came across this, which is not kind of formally or stylistically similar exactly, but it's an incense burner in the shape of an octagonal shrine. So I was just like, okay, maybe these models are also incense burners. And so I did a search to that effect, and came across the Incense Burner Virtual Museum, because why not? Which just kind of, pulls links off the internet of incense burners from various cultures and various styles. And at the very bottom of the first page of Asian incense burners was this guy, which resembled another object in our collection that I was trying to figure out more about. And indeed, one more search revealed that there are a kind of small subset of these Japanese incense burners in the shape of kind of small, modest houses or tea huts. And so that was really cool that accidentally I discovered what this other object might be. So the ones I found online were about 4 inches. And from looking at the picture of ours, I had kind of assumed it was larger. I kind of assumed it was like 12 inches, and kind of like this. I also assumed that it was square, and that the picture's kind of taken from a slightly oblique angle. And I was so wrong. It is about 4 inches, and it's rhomboid shaped. So this is why it's really important to look at the actual object when you're doing this kind of work. A lot of the examples online had removable roofs, and so also in checking out the actual object, I wanted to find out if ours had a removable roof. It did not, but it did kind of look like maybe the roof had been rusted shut. So it's possible that maybe at some point it did. But I also discovered this little round hole of the bottom side, about 5/8 inch diameter, which would be about the right size to fit one of those incense cones. So it was pretty supportive of my theory that this indeed was one of these incense burners. Burning incense is a very particular history and place within Japanese culture. Like in many parts of the world, incense is burned as part of prayer or meditation, particularly in Buddhist ceremonies. But it has also, like tea ceremony, become this very kind of codified, refined art and process with its own special implements. Games are played comparing different scents, and I got to experience this once at the Japan Society in Boston. And incense could also be used during the tea ceremony as kind of a separate thing, and the burners for that could take many different forms. And so it's somewhat appropriate that this burner resembles a tea hut, which is this special kind of modest outbuilding that you have set aside for your tea ceremony. And indeed, this object was included in an exhibition here at the Fleming in 2005 on the worlds of tea. There's just a few details for cuteness factor, and one is that it's kind of hard to see, it's hard to get a good picture, but there's a miniature couple inside the house having dinner or tea. Let's see if I can aim it there. It's also, I think, interesting that the hole where the incense would go is positioned so that you would be able to see the incense through that kind of rectangular window in the back. Just another kind of cool detail. And even like the details of the flower pot on the bench outside and the fringe on the door is very cool. There's also one other object that I still haven't figured out, but it's kind of a miniature of this miniature. It's another tiny, even tinier Japanese style hut or house, as you can see, about an inch all around. Still figuring out what purpose that could serve, but it's a fun aside. I still don't know about that Indian palanquin, but I'll keep looking. So back to Japanese objects brings us back to what I started with, which is this group of Indian miniatures. So the question was, are they playthings for very sophisticated children? Are they decorative objects for adults? Or do they have some kind of ritual purpose? And it turns out to be a little bit of all three. These objects are part of a yearly holiday in Japan that dates back to the Edo period, which is the late 17th to the late 19th centuries, and is still celebrated today. It's called the Doll Festival, or Hina Matsuri, and I'm sorry for my Japanese pronunciation. It takes place every March 3rd, which is tomorrow. Happy Hina Matsuri, everyone! So the holiday is an occasion to pray for the health and happiness of the girls in the family, and was also traditionally a chance for a girl to practice her hostess skills. The centerpiece of the event is this stepped altar that you would create in your home with a red carpet, with dolls on the top representing the emperor and empress in Heian period dress, that is the late 8th to the early 10th century, and there are various ladies in waiting and court musicians on the steps below. And then on the lower steps are these miniature lacquer household items. It said that if families do not put the dolls and the miniatures away very quickly once the holiday is over, that the daughters will be cursed with late marriages. The miniature household items were originally modeled on these wedding sets, full-size wedding sets of lacquerware given as dowries for elite women, sometimes consisting of more than 50 individual items. I'll show an example of that in a minute. Okay. Sorry. We have some of the examples of the full-size versions of these objects. So here are pictures of our full-size versions on the left next to our miniature versions on the right, which is just so cool. So this would be a mirror stand, and that's a mirror with its case, and that would rest on the stand on the side, and then a document box with ropes to wrap it. It's just so cool. And so here's an example of a particularly fine set of one of these groups of miniature objects. This is from the Tachibana Museum in Yanagawa, which is the island, very southern island in Japan. And it passed down from the Tachibana family that controlled that clan during the Edo period. So it was a particularly fine example. We know the shop that these came from. And you see ones that are very similar to some of ours. So you see the towel and rack there, the mirror and stand there, and the bench very much like ours. And there are also some really great details in here. So you see the game boards complete with their pieces. That's a set of the game Go. These little, maybe small photographs or prints or something like that. So it's kind of going back to what so enchanted me about the miniatures at those conventions when I was a kid. And I said I'd talk about what we know and what we don't know about these objects. And what we don't know really is exactly how old ours are, exactly who made them or where they came from. As you saw, this category of object, they all kind of look similarly, whether they're older or newer, similar kind of lacquer patterns, which are similar to the full-size category of the object. So we can't pin it down so exactly. We know these objects came into our collection in 1948, so we know they're at least that old. So I would guess that they are 19th or early 20th century. But that's kind of about as specific as we can get at this point. So that's kind of where I am for now with this project. But who knows sort of how curiosity will lead me to discover more about the rest of the things in this category. And so I wanted to close with the thought that curiosity is really kind of one of the most important parts about being a curator. Often when we suggest or start planning an exhibition or other scholarly project, it's not because we already know everything there is to know about that topic. In all likelihood, we've chosen it precisely because it's something that we want to learn more about. For a curator, the process of curating an exhibition is how you go through that intellectual discovery. And that process is going to differ from curator to curator and museum to museum and project to project. Some curators want to do all the research before they even touch an exhibition checklist, and others kind of let the objects that have attracted them guide the direction of the show. And I think I've shown that that's kind of more my MO. So I hope I've been able to share with you some of what interests and excites me about these objects and how we will go about making those discoveries in the lead up to the show. Thank you. I want to give a quick shout out to Olivia Ambo, who's my intern, who helped with research for this project and is helping with show of our Asian collection, which will go up next spring. So I will open it up to questions, anything you want to ask. Yes?
At the very beginning you said that these little objects, you said Japanese or made to look like Japanese things. Is there a chance that, was it like a fad to make Japanese objects elsewhere in the world?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I would say these are 99% made in Japan. I think it's just such a particular category that I don't see American artisans like imitating that. In general, I feel like, can relate to the question, there was definitely a fad for Japanese objects, but I think it would tend to be Japanese makers were making them for Western audiences, right? Like they knew that Western people were coming over or wanted objects imported in and that they wanted to buy them. So, and there are some other objects in this grouping that were definitely kind of tourist items. You know, there's a group of kind of metal miniature procession in the African gallery. That was when the metal makers were no longer employed by the king. They started making things for tourists. So that's definitely a trend in a lot of the objects in my collection. Yeah.
Where was that the guild that used to go with your
Yeah. So the convention, when we started going, it was held in New York City, which is where I'm from. And then partway through, they moved to Rhinebeck, New York. So we kept going for a couple years after that, which meant taking the train out of the city, which was so unthinkable as a city kid. And I think I just looked it up, and I think this year it's in Teaneck, New Jersey. So it stayed in the metropolitan area.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I like the way you make that relationship between curator and curious. As a curator of books at Special Collections, we have a miniature book collection. And that's great examples, and I've always wondered why people made these things. You know, we think of some of these objects as, well, they would look good in a dollhouse, you know, that kind of thinking, but what do you do with miniature books? I
Yeah.
don't have the answer.
Yeah. Well, that's really good to know, because maybe I'll come to you for some loans. But I did find in our collection we have a miniature Bible. So probably related, maybe we should go to you guys. But I mean, in a Bible, you kind of get like, oh, you always have this holy word near you, and it gets all packed. But really, how practical is that, right? Like, it's maybe more for the symbolic value than actually being able to read your tiny Bible. Yes.
This isn't a question, but I went to Turkey last May, and in many of the museums they had miniatures, and it was like amazing that, you know, of the horses, of the tea, you know, like the teapots of this, and I guess of documenting how things were in that day. That was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and that's another category that I think you can find in our collection, in that, you know, when this museum was more focused on natural history or anthropology, rather than being more focused on fine art as we are now, some of the displays were using miniature, you know, I found in storage a miniature Native American village, you know, and kind of you can still see dioramas like that, like at the Natural History Museum in New York, so that, you know, was a way that we displayed and illustrated parts of our collection with these kind of diorama-like things. So there are, I think, some of those around too. Yeah, Jane.
So are there particular periods where miniatures are more sort of in production? Because I'm thinking of the Chicago Art Institute that has the room of
Thorn.
yeah, and so that's obviously of a period,
Yeah.
you know, where and so I think culturally maybe different times had were more involved in miniature construction, and if it had to do with the Gilded Age versus, you know, our time, you know, when, and, you know, are the miniatures being done now? I mean, I know you showed contemporary examples, but in the culture, I mean, dollhouses, I guess, are still, you know, of interest to people, but could they, is there a cultural, or a cultural lens by which to?
Absolutely, and I think the ship models are a good example. So Popular Science is all digitized on Google Books, so you can search through it. And if you look for model Spanish galleon, you'll see that they devoted many issues to that, and like would keep bringing it up and show pictures of people who'd made their model Spanish galleons or other boats. So there was clearly this cultural moment. I think those are from the late 20s, and the guy made this in 1940. But there is that moment there where it seems to be a really widespread hobby for people to be making their models of ships,
And
right?
airplanes. People
Yeah.
make airplanes, but I don't know if people are doing that.
Right, it's more of a niche now. Yeah.
Sort of piggyback on that, I just wondered, you have model railroaders
Mhm.
who are still working, and I didn't know if that sort of
qualified as a miniature, of course, you could define
Oh, sure.
what
Yeah.
you want to call miniature.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that speaks to like every creative hobby kind of has its niche. And as you're saying, there is this cultural lens where that might ebb and flow and become sort of more popular and widespread at a certain moment than in other moments. But again, I think, you know, obviously this guild of miniature artisans, I mean, a lot of them were professionals, but a lot of them might have been professionals who started out as amateurs, or some of them were amateurs. You know, so, and I think the internet also has only kind of proliferated that ability for niche specialists and hobbyists to connect with each other.
Well, also investigating the difference between amateur and professional. Like
Right.
what is actually the demarcation?
Right.
But, you know, in fine art, I mean, there are those who make and those who don't make, and so wondering about that as well. Because you need to actually want to sit down and make,
Right.
whichever category you're in.
Right, right, and whether you're doing that for yourself or
Yeah.
to sell, and there's a whole spectrum of that. Is this your full-time job?
Right.
Or, you know, it's something you on the side? Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you all for coming.